Today, Rinpoche completed this section on the 3 types of suffering in the great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment. He pointed out an apparent contradiction between that which is posited in the great treatise and other important works.
Nije, ta dunga da kunyu kuna samba tala, ta ne karsukure, duden denji tuma sombi guba, duden dunga papi denba, den kunyu papi denba, den guba papi denba, den lang papi denba, dunga denba tambu sonro ta, tambu sonro guba, tada cheta ngotu rins, ngotu jula chi rinba yins. Tene dunga guba ngoy ni marba. Dunga guba ngoy tala, ane dunga je samba, tro samba, son samba, saji son marba.
The chi dan che drag.
Kwa shi shira susi shira shira ni marba. Ane shi tala kazire.
Sun je dru.
O te mare. Kwa shi dunga samba tala, dunga je samba, tro samba, son sambas. Ta kata nga sun den dunga papi denpa os, den dunga papi denpa os, dunga te wate shi taba sheba la, dunga je tang, dunga tro tang, dunga son te zo wate shea kei sheba duwa. Pashin tu su, nga tu jen le dro tang denpa na tang shebe ka so, ane dunga denpa tu wate, ane pashin tu su dunga denpi tsenji te yewa. Wate kei tang tsoba mungu yorwa. Ma tu dunga je tang, dunga tro tang wate sushira munduwa. Wate langri to te je buduwa ta. Ta nga tsu wate dunga son samba te je te tsa, tro te tsa, ta nga tsu son ka turo, son te langri chenpo peyi je na, nija nishu sa dru re, nija nishu sa dru ke ching tama tendu.
Okay, pinning de la, so. Okay, so right now we're again looking at Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment, and specifically the section on training your mind in the stage of the path shared in common with beings of medium capacity. So under that major heading, there's 4 categories that we find in the outline. First, the mental training, then the measure of the attitude, or the measure of the determination to be free. Dispelling misconceptions is number 3, and then a 4th category of ascertaining the nature of the path leading to liberation. So these are the 4 categories that we find within that. And then when we look at it in terms of the actual mental training, we find under, again, the mental training under the major heading of training the mind in the stage of the path shared in common with beings of medium capacity. We then find the section that has identifying the mind intent on liberation, and then the method for developing the mind intent on liberation. So there's 2 categories under the mental training, and under the category of the method for developing the mind intent on liberation, there's 2 categories: reflection on suffering and its origin, and then the second category of reflection from the viewpoint of the 12 links of dependent origination. So the first category, reflection on suffering and its origin, we find 2 categories: reflection on the truth of suffering, the downfalls or the faults of cyclic existence, and then a second category of reflection of the process of cyclic existence in terms of its origin. So we have these 2 categories. And then the first category, reflection on the truth of suffering, we find two categories. First, showing the significance of Buddha's asserting the truth of suffering as the first of the four truths. When the Buddha stated that this is the superior truth of suffering, this is the superior truth of origin, this is the superior truth of cessation, and this is the superior truth of path, he stated those in that specific order. So this is showing what the reason is for that. And when we look at the Prajnaparamita text, the Abhisama Alamkara, we find that it's very abbreviated in there. It just says the established and then comma truths, Drutandemba. So these established truths. So we find it referenced there in the Abhisama Alamkara, and that is significant to this first category under the reflection on the truth of suffering, the faults of cyclic existence, and showing the order of those Four Noble Truths being truth of suffering, truth of origin, truth of cessation, and truth of path. So then we get into the second category, which is the actual meditation on suffering. So that category of the actual meditation on suffering, we find two categories. Reflection on the universal or the general sufferings of cyclic existence, and then second category of reflection on the specific sufferings of cyclic existence. So in the first category, reflection on the general universal sufferings of cyclic existence, we find three categories. First, reflection on the 8 types of suffering. Second, reflection on the 6 types of suffering. And then third, reflection on the 3 types of suffering. So we've gone through the 8 types of suffering and the 6 types of suffering, and now we've arrived at reflection on the 3 types of suffering. And when we look at this text, it's very good because in the Parshin text, the general meaning of perfection, we find the definition of suffering and divisions and so forth, but we don't find I'm sorry. So let me just reverse that. So we have these various divisions of suffering. So when the Buddha stated that this is the superior truth of suffering, this is what the Buddha was talking about, these different divisions of suffering. And in the general meaning of perfection text, the Prajnaparamita texts, we find that, yes, we do have these definitions and divisions, but we don't have these divisions by 8, 6, and 3. So the great treatise on the stage of the path is very good because we find that breakdown in here. So now we're beginning with the 3 types of suffering, and in English we find that on page 289. Lesson. So we went through this once, but if we can go through it again, it would be good another time.
다 동에서도 가서 동에지 동에 유 동에 차반 뒤지 동에서 뒤정아 지다 도도 동에서 들에도 동에지 동에데 유 동에도 와데 사지 소와도 와도 말바 사지 소와도 도와들래 유 동에 동에지 동에서 땅아둘래 지나 사람들 동에 용어대 아주로도 동에지 동에 다 되네 다 차반 뒤지 동에서 초와 땅을 잡아나도 소화도와 많이 봐. 소화동에 많이 소화주로. 또 소화당뇨 말이야. 소화당뇨. 들 처반 주제지 등에 세지 잡아나면도 와. 어때 동에 손도 어때 동에 손대 주의 등에 동에지 등에 처반 주제 등 소화당뇨. 다음은 어때 다들 동에 손도 마시에 발라 자제베는 사진이 지금도 와. 사디로도 오마빌로스 사등아 그러면 바바토메게 사득이 로제나 어디 등하송들에 안에 사지 dwi지 온도 사지 dwi지 지금도와 너 오마빌로들 오들니 니 말베 어디지 다때네 다 사디로도 오밀로 사지니 제 등하송시에 발라 사지니 제다 사디로들라 안장하지 사지 dwi지도 사지 dwi
Then umilu gatsu ni, umilu gatsu due.
Lutume sadi lutro sadi lutre ne sadi duro du.
Then
same. Then oma lutre ni marva ul hegro.
Okay.
다 사디로 뒤는 다 아무때 유도게 동해지도게 소화 당뇨 손데 뒤는 담부손도 호텔에도와 메인 코너 가갈래고는 마도 어디 대송으로 되거도와
Okay, that's it. Tambo the soa dewa soa dugyo.
담보 때 소화 대화로 유도게
Okay, tuche.
유도와데 소화 사지 소화 대화도 말해봐.
Tuche.
유도와지 동해 당 동해원에지 다 유도는 차반 주지 등은 소화 당뇨자도 소화 안에 대화에 많이 동해에 많이 봐. 어디 소화들래 소화 당뇨스. 다 때가도 도바된 도와다. 단 유도와 소화 대화로 봐. 소화 대화들래 네 소화 대화 집에 세고 말해서 소화 대화도 소화 때문에 생산중 다 디유 사지 그걸로 소화 대화도 인설하고 그래서 저는 저기 나를 좀 들려도 다 동해서 해야 돼. 안에 대도 소화 때문에 생산중 다 디유 사지 그걸로 동해 인설하고 그래서 네 다 잡아 두지 된 거 소화 당뇨로 와. 소화 당뇨 때도 소화 때문에 생산중 다 안에 사지기 유익한 걸로 때 소화 당뇨 인설하고 그래서 어떻게도 두 번도 두 번. 다 유도와 소화도와 때도 소화 때문에 생산중 때 소화도와 이바타스나 라린 집은 거지 지나 인설하고 와. 생산중도 좀 소화도와 인설하나 and send soa is low. Send soa ina, send Senruin, but soa image.
Okay.
To do that.
Near the lag, the mambo earring and jing.
What the college
Okay, two china. So we begin again on page 289, and we find the outline meditation on the three types of suffering. So we have the suffering of change, the suffering of pain, or sometimes the suffering of suffering, and then the suffering of conditionality. And this we translate as pervasive compounded suffering most of the time. So we have these three types of suffering. So when we look at the suffering of change itself, this is referring to those contaminated happy feelings. So the suffering of change itself refers to contaminated happy feelings. And then the next category, the next category, the suffering of pain or the suffering of suffering, is referring to that feeling of suffering, of like when we have a disease, or that pain that we experience when we have a disease. And then the suffering of conditionality or pervasive compounded suffering is referring to those equal, or it's translated as neutral feelings sometimes, or equal feelings, meaning it is neither a feeling of, it is a subject that is neither a feeling of happiness or a feeling of suffering. So it's a subject that is a feeling that is neither a feeling of happiness or a feeling of suffering. So this is what a neutral feeling is referring to. So when we look at the text and we look at Jamyang Shepa's outline, under the suffering of change, which is the first category in the Lam Rim Chenmo, we find that he states that there are two major headings. The first major heading is the points posited in the compendium and levels, so Asanga's compendiums and the levels of yogic deeds. So this is the first category, and Jamyang Shepa breaks that down into 7 different categories. And then the next category that Jamyang Shepa states is the views according to the Madhyamaka. So the Madhyamaka views, or the Madhyamaka points. And then those are broken down into 2 categories. So when we look at the first category, which is the suffering of change, we find that, again, Jamyang Shepa's first category has 7 categories. So the first 3 of those 7 refer to happy feelings, painful feelings, and then equal or neutral feelings. So these are the first three of the seven. And they're named something different, but this is what they're referring to. This one. Oh, no, I didn't. When we look at the points that are made in here, a doubt can arise because here in the great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment, it states that that the suffering of change not only includes the feeling itself, but the main mind, the mental factors or the other mental processes, it says here, and also the objects that are when apprehended give rise to that feeling, or when perceived give rise to that feeling. So a doubt arises here because if we state that the mind and the mental factors both are contained within this, and then we state that the suffering of change is a contaminated happy feeling, then we can say, do we say then that the mind then has this happy feeling? And then if that's the case, does that mean that mind and mental factors are not mutually exclusive because there's a common locus of this feeling present? So we find that it states that all of the sufferings, the suffering of change, the suffering of pain or suffering of suffering, and the pervasive compounded suffering have this factor, that it's not only the feeling itself, but the mind, the mental factors, and the actual object that when apprehended gives rise to this. So if it refers then to all of these, then how can we say that there is this feeling that is with the mind? If these are happy feelings, painful feelings, and neutral feelings. If the mind has this feeling, then there's a common locus between mind and mental factors. So Geshe Rinpoche posits that this is this is so, that these three all have not only the feeling itself, but also the mind, mental factors, and the object apprehended. But then that conflicts with when we state to show the suffering of change, we say contaminated happy feelings, and then if we say then the mind and mental factors are involved, then this seems to be mutually exclusive with the other points made. So this is why doubt arises. Sorry for the long-windedness. I just wanted to make sure I got it.
네 표면가 대신도 차왔더라 추세와 떠나 더완조와 따분에 코아바나지 초아드와 대스 주도 와서도 도터레스 초아드와 대 근데 시바나야 야 등에지 주등에 로스 주등고 어느 가서 그래 당가서 왔더니 이제 뭔가 좀 문 사바이나 문 치바이나 안들만의 차음을 마차도 어떨래 초점다바이나 더완의 중으로다 더완의 중으로 양한테 그 동에 차는으로 어떤 천지들의 잡아는 무도에 천지 페미간 대신도 차왔더라 추세왔더나 누굴 매치바이나 안 어떨 주공나부터 제로 어떨래 초점을 쳐바이나 더완의 중으로 대군의 동에 차음을 어떤 주등에서 호텔에서 졸라 추세왔다나 도와 나와 답은에서 코아바나지 도와도와데 주등에서 테레스 와도와
맞아.
근데 시바나야 근데 시바는 나서 양 죽을 동에 정으로 동에 제유 주등에 로스 주등에서 호텔에서 다
맞아.
대야 소코나 많이 제스 네 소 주도와 도와된 소코나 말이스 소코나 많이지 대단 총바된비 센센루 나다스 대단 총바되면 센센루 걸로 소화도와 일어우레스
맞아.
강라미 소화도와 강라미비 강라미네 제비 유사지 나자 유등으로스 소화등의 그 유사지대야 유등으레스 소화등의 유드페지 소화도와 유드페지 리잔지 말베데 리잔지 리제 이도와는 질라테는 소화도와 제도 말배. 리젯 소화도와 임바타. 리젯 주주 마이바타. 소화이는 쉐바이 맞아도 어떤 도반도다.
소화돼요.
간라미네 제비 위사지 나장 유도가로스 간라미네 소화돼 간라미 위사지 리젯다부터 소화도와 이나 안 리젯으로 소화도와 쉐바로다.
맞아요.
어디 대부분도다.
소화돼요 쉐바.
소화도와 이나 쉐바 임차그로 세중 임차그로 더 손대게 센세중 그걸로 소화도와 이러나 생드 주 제대로 소마되면 생드 소화이 맞다. 세중이 맞다. 어떤에 게는도 어떤에 근데 가서 배치 이제 레던 좀 게지 진짜 세중 수소와 임베지 레던 좀 뭐니 개발했어. 저 세중 가지고 자지 단데 가지고 자지 그거 나버서는 거면 와.
They got to they laid on Yomon Gelwai.
레던 좀 개발이 되더니 세중 수소와 임베 파신 시대도 와요로.
Dene Semjo.
레던 요문이 세중으로
Lasso.
드진 개발해서 세중 소소와 임베 세중 가지고 자지 장데 두두 나베서 간 개오면 와.
All 51 are
대지 우리 단데 세도 그걸로 좋아해서는 대부분 와.
Lasso.
단들 자지베 다 도카둘 첸덴 도저요 말다. 네, 나와라지 첸덴 나로로 될 도저도다. 네, 주도와 초와도와 당 총바대비 센센중당 유사지 근거로 초와도와 도바이 초와도와 마이스 어디 배신 이제 그걸로 어떻게라고 하면 돼. 전담 차노도와 초와도와 당 총바대비 센센중도 초와도와 아이 마이 초와도와 나 도이
Dua Sena
저는 뒤바레스 저는 뒤바레스 저는 뒤바레스
of the type.
유사지대 저는 뒤바레스 유사지대 조로조 말바 저는 뒤바이 초도 마이데 조이 메시 조도 시방게와 이메시 what 도반도 호텔에
Okay. Then the Charan, the Senshi, the Ma Yuna, the Meja, the Charan Senshi, the Chiba. Okay, the Dixie.
근데 분명히 제시도 차와라 초시와 떠나서 당 주문 치바이나 될 치고나면 자고 말ပဲ
Lasso.
어들 추담은 추나오데 도안에 요로
Lasso.
어디 주의도 와서 데레스 때 나시반에 아주 동에 차는 그래서 유동에레스
Lasso. So the suffering of change, and then Jamyang Shepa Tambo, Ewa Tambo.
단 저하지 저 요와 담도 초아송도 제제제
So we read the great treatise. So it states the meditation on the three types of suffering, and the suffering of change. Pleasant feelings experienced by beings in cyclic existence are like the pleasure felt when cool water is applied to an inflamed boil or a carbuncle. As the temporary feeling fades, the pain reasserts itself. This is called the suffering of change, and includes not only the feeling itself, but also the mind and other mental processes or the other mental factors that are similar to it, as well as the contaminated objects when perceived give rise to that feeling. So here, this is under the category that refers to the suffering of change. And here it's saying that, giving an example of when you have maybe an inflamed boil and then you put some cool water on it, there's a temporary happiness, there's a contaminated happiness that takes place, but then that type of happiness then transforms back into pain, then it changes back into pain. It says that it reasserts itself. So this is what is meant by the suffering of change. So it says this is called the suffering of change. So when you have this temporary happiness, this happy feeling, and then it goes away. So this is then the suffering of change. So then when we get into the main points here that Rinpoche is making, it says includes, this is called the suffering of change, and includes not only the feeling itself, but also the mind and other mental processes that are similar to it, as well as the contaminated objects when perceived give rise to that feeling. So if we look at that last point, that those contaminated objects which give rise to that feeling, if we take, for instance, a tactile sensation, the tactile sensation that is attractive or that we like or that is wonderful. So is that tactile sensation a feeling? Because tactile sensation categorically would fall under form. So then, this feeling falls categorically under a mental factor. So we have mutual exclusivity. We have contradiction there because these things are mutually exclusive. So how can it be a feeling and also a tactile sensation when the tactile sensation is form? And then when we back up and we look at the main mind and enter other mental processes or mental factors, we find that there's an issue. If then there is a feeling in the mind, then we state that then mental factors and mind have a common locus and are not mutually exclusive, because in the Prajnaparamita Parshin text, the general meaning of perfection, we find a statement that says the karma and afflictions are mutually exclusive, as well as all of the other types of mental factors. So those 51 different types of mental factors are mutually exclusive. So how can we say then that there is some inclusion here when we find these statements made in other texts? And then Jamyang Shepa's commentary doesn't point out this point about the seeming contradiction between the texts. We actually find that in Ngawang Rabgye's text, where he finds this contradiction and states that how can this mind and mental factors have this common locus? How is it possible that there is a feeling of any sort of, in this case we're speaking of a happy feeling that the mind can experience if the mind and mental factors are mutually exclusive, and feeling is necessarily a mental factor. So right here, yeah. So feeling is necessarily a mental factor. So in consciousness we have mind and mental factors, and these two things are contradictory or are mutually exclusive. So it seems that then there's a doubt that arises within us when we see the point made here that's saying the object. So Rinpoche gave the tactile sensation, which is form and feeling are mutually exclusive. And then the mind and mental factors, the mental factor, form, feeling is necessarily a mental factor, and mind and mental factors are mutually exclusive. So these are the points that are made about that, and again, the doubt that comes up. So that's it. Tactile sensation is not form, so then it is not form. Rinpoche is giving all the consequences. Tactile sensation is not form. It's not form because it's a happy feeling. So this is how the debate would take place. Well, it can't be a happy feeling because it is form. And then form and feeling are mutually exclusive. Then it is. Then mind. Then the other way Rinpoche said it is. So mind has feeling. Mind is. Mind and mental factors are not mutually exclusive because mind has feeling, and feeling is a mental factor. So these are the points that would arise when we read this and apply and compare it to some other texts. I get everything, Rabgye?
Yes, almost.
Thank you. Yeah?
다 니바 다 주도와 차네 다 니바 동에 니바 동에 뭔데 저도와 제 차이 동바 될라 사주라 수비 주지지 리바다 테나 치 동에와 진도 초와 동해 시바샤데 동해 시바샤데 테나제바나 르상 네 le sang saint don shepe shir dongen de ne kemi sozi yeno example kemal wa nasan de tamba yino de tendabures teang choa jibu meba nga ta rosa ta choa dongen de somba de sen jun ta di yu sa ji ngolo choa dongen yin nang hama ni ju doa den dabures nga ta ros what the ta gante what the dream sa ma de nya kha yo ke what the jile ne cha ge chue do chue ba yin na what the dongen je mo ma dongen je ro what the dongen chen ja de dongen chen je what the 제 자유동화 들라 차줄라 소비 주지제리 바다 체바나스 들 차주 만야가 저들 차주 쇼바이나 나사 당거로다 체나 체 동양화 진도 는 초아 동행 셰바샤데스 초아 동행지 드나 제바 나 제바타네 라주데지 가자를 lösen 동화 셰비 셔 동행데스 Kemi sozi jenos, kemal nasatan ote nasa jo ote dabur example. Teyang choa jibu meba dan hatar osa. Choa debatan dabures. Tatan soa sembe sen jun dan yu sa jik ngalo ote jagures. Jirmi sun lo ote yodroda.
So the next category, the suffering of pain. The suffering of pain, when a painfully inflamed boil makes contact with an irritant, such as salt water, it is agonizing. This is how you recognize the feeling of pain. Painful feelings like this constitute the suffering of pain, because as soon as they arise, the mind and body are tormented, as in the case of kidney pain. Also, as explained above, the suffering of pain is not just feeling. So what this means is that the suffering of pain is not just feeling. It's the same as when we look at the suffering of change, where it says, but also the main mind, the other mental processes or mental factors, and then that are similar to it in the contaminated objects which give rise to that feeling. So the objects, mind, and mental factors as well. So it's the suffering of pain is the same as the suffering of change in that sense. So this first point that's made is an example of if you have this sore, and so here it's an inflamed boil, and you add salt to it, and here it's salt water, and to it, it will give rise to a large amount of suffering, a large amount of pain. That pain is what the suffering of pain is referring to, or the suffering of suffering is referring to. This says this is how you recognize the feeling of pain. So then painful feelings like this are the suffering of suffering, or the suffering of pain. This is necessarily a suffering feeling, a feeling of suffering.
This way. But that you doing that the Chaban Duji doing so the Swa Danu Shade. Somebody does Somebody Duji doing this. Ribat and Yinka Matribi, Duji, Dretsawa Tabune, Sabat and Chibi, Swa Danu te, Swa Doaya Mai, doing Maimbi, Swa Danu Lagres. Nang and Jason J. Over Tele. Nyomobi nang and Jason J. Then Duji doing a race, Duji doing a loss, Duji doing a loss. Tayang Chua Jibula, Majawa and Hata Rose, Chua Danu to what they, Tatan Swa de Sensa Junta, Usajik and Alote, Chua Danu Jagures, Hamanda Bures, what to Sultubadota, Mazilla. Tang Auraji Tubajesha, the Lotte Cushion Age, Jaji Hotel, Chenrezig no to Germandute, Jaji Bishal Fiji, Patient Gatabi Ingrata, Jaji Bisham Wero, Pashi Oma, Dua, Mobior, what to son of Nande, to son of Lieutenant Dabi Ingre.
Pashi, Zu, Uma, Namgyal. Parshinzu Uma Nandra.
What the Pashin Putunga Yuri Jajibal.
Dua. Okay.
Now then, Shepa Medina. What the Zutan do the Pashin Kayuro, Jajib.
Lesser.
Is a Buddha Yuri.
Then Parshin got to do it. Ma?
Pashin Kojiga Yuri, Kojiga.
So.
Muduji Kojiga, Koji Yuri.
The third type of suffering is the suffering of conditionality. So going back to Jamyang Shepa's outline, this is number 3. The first category, happy feelings. Second category, suffering, painful feelings. And then the third category is equal feelings or neutral feelings. So this is where it begins. Contaminated neutral feelings are like an inflamed boil which is in contact with neither soothing nor irritating substances. Because these feelings coexist with dysfunctional tendencies, they constitute the suffering of conditionality, which, as explained above, does not refer to the feelings alone. So here, once again, it not only refers to the feelings, but the mind and the mental factors that are similar to it, as well as the contaminated objects which, when apprehended, give rise to that feeling. So that's what that means there. Once again, this doubt may arise when we see this point that these feelings, these neutral feelings, also fall categorically under the same thing as the suffering of change and the suffering of pain, meaning that it's not only the feelings but the mind and the mental factors in those objects. Jamyang Shepa again doesn't address this. Ngawang Rabgye addresses this point where the mind and the mental factors are normally mutually exclusive. Jamyang Shepa is a great master and wrote many different works. He has a collection that's similar to Panchen Sonandrapa, and we find within that collection the text on the Prajnaparamita, the text on the Abhidharma, the text on the Madhyamaka, the text on the Pramanavartika Karika, or the commentary on the Compendium of Valid Cognition, and text on the Vinaya. So we find a large amount of works that Jamyang Shepa presents, but we find this doubt that arises in Ngawang Rabgye's text in relation to this last point again about the mind and mental factors and the object. Diksa.
Diksa. Oje tatane. Tas sumba suntaro. Ta jeba tere jeba delwade jebe tesendu jeba tsoa sunle nengale jesus tsoa dongaji dongaji donga chaban duje donga desundle nengale anewade tsoa dwala tenen do chachigres tsoa dongela tenen konduche yungres tsoa tanula ten tamu tekunani la mu maribada wote tsuche yungres tesungu wote tsoa sunde ane dosungi jumutonga chegures tsoa sun la ten dosun chegre dosun de jesuna wote nyega chegure tsoa sunde ane tsoa de waten de shachi ju tongje yo mare tsoa de ne de konduji ju tongje yo mare tsoa danyu de ane tumuji ju motonga chegures wote sumbal wote le de du.
So we've gone through the first 3, and now we arrived at number 4, or the fourth category. And the fourth category deals with what these 3 different types of feelings, the feeling of happiness, the feeling of pain, and neutral feelings, which are referring to the suffering of change, the suffering of suffering, or the suffering of pain, and the suffering of conditionality, or pervasive compounded suffering. What difficulty arises in dependence upon these? So what did these cause? What comes about from these different feelings? And we find the point's made that the three poisons are caused by these three types of feelings. So the three poisons come of attachment, anger, and ignorance arise and are caused by these three feelings. So the feeling of happiness, which is the suffering of change, gives rise to attachment. The feeling of pain, or the feeling of suffering, which is the suffering of suffering or suffering of pain, gives rise to anger or aversion. And then this neutral or equal feeling, which is the pervasive compounded suffering, gives rise to ignorance. So these three poisons are caused by these three feelings, these three types of suffering. So this is the problem with them. This is the negativity behind them. So then the neutral feeling is presented insofar as the suffering of conditionality is affected by previous karma as well as the afflictions and coexists with seeds that will produce future suffering and affliction. It coexists with persistent dysfunctional tendencies. So this is Sowa Danyo. So this is the section on neutral feeling still.
chaba jeba dang suwa dewa la tene dwasha je ngure jeba dang dunga jeba na kontro pewa dang dodo kanya me suwa dang nyurwa maybe ne ngane tu tubi ne lula mataba la taba dans ne taba la suba zimbi tumo jeba njurwas ta suwa dang nyurwa tene ne tamu takuna nyela maribata lendela maribata ta tanjin la so lo she mo yoro che ngore se da che ban joros o to ba to de jibare.
Thus attached. So now we move into number 4. So 4 is the category which is independence upon happy feelings, attachment arises. Independence upon painful feelings or suffering feelings, anger or aversion arises. And dependence upon neutral feelings or equal feelings, ignorance arises. So it shows how each one of these individual poisons have an individual cause. So the attachment is caused by a happy feeling, anger caused by suffering or painful feelings, and ignorance caused by equal feelings. So thus attachment increases when a pleasant feeling arises. And hostility increases when pain arises. Ignorance increases when you misapprehend the body. So attachment increases when one has a happy feeling. Hostility or anger increases when painful feeling arises, and ignorance increases when you have a neutral feeling, a misapprehend the body, which is part of a dysfunctional situation that is neither pleasant nor painful, as permanent when it is in fact impermanent. So this is all number in the category number 4.
What is one?
And so here it says ignorance increases when you misapprehend the body. So ignorance can refer to the ignorance of karma and its results, and then a second type of ignorance, which is ignorance of the nature of reality. So these are the 2 types of ignorance. So it says ignorance increases when you misapprehend the body, which is part of a dysfunctional situation that is neither pleasant nor painful as permanent when it is in fact impermanent. So it's under the influence of afflictions. This, as a note, this dysfunctional situation means it's under the influence of those things, those negativities.
ne shema roa nga chewa la subi dunga che la sa de cha ga ju she ba la te ne nga ndu song ne ma da ne ha ma yi la no du ba yi na roa nga chi bi ne roa nga chewa la subi dunga che la sa de cha ga ju she ba la te ne nga song song de che ga de ma le che ga de 살 지그레스 로왕아 하마이 카가시바 이나 로아리투 네제로 질라사 시당기네 콘도 그 주시발라테네 네 냥에로서 동에 뭐 비치고요 동에다 시망난도 난도 동에 지신스 니와이다 돌을 전도그레스 다트모기네 드니 지제비 동에니까 모두 비실 쇼보고사 너무 좋아다는 달라데네 어때 아니 어때 가서 그래 맞을 하던 어떤 로왕아도 제가 주시고 말씀을 드려봤다 너무 기네 되니지 집이 동행이가 모두 싫어서 되니 집이 다 좋아도 되게 내 주시 발된 도샤지 달라데는 로왕아지 공도 주시 발라데네 공도 좋아도게 제 언들 공도 주시 발된 내 손을 찍으랬어. 어때 되니 이제는 쉐르 좋아다는 라데네 코네가 좋아도 매바이나 달라데네 쿠제제네 도와지 용거래 양한테 제시 발라데네 동해 좀 그러니까 그 제시 그래서 다 도모기네 되니 집이 동해니까 모두 이셔
So number 5 deals with what the individual poisons give rise to, or what is the problem that comes from them. So it says, attachment gives rise to suffering such as future rebirth in the 5 realms, the realms of hell, beings, hungry ghosts, animals, humans, and deities. So this is referring to the 5 realms of cyclic existence. If we were to add demigods to that list, then we would have the 6 realms of cyclic existence. But here we just have the 5, and note the demigods are concluded within the gods section. So this is where we have 5. So it's saying that by having attachment, which comes about by a happy feeling, one has a future rebirth and or future going. So a future going. So there are 5 places, migrations. I think Droanga, 5 migrations. I think they translate it as. So there are 5 migrations, or we could say 6 if we add demigods. And then it says hostility brings about suffering, such as sorrow in this life, as well as suffering. Future suffering of the miserable realms. So hostility or anger gives rise to the lower realms of cyclic existence, gives rise to, it says, such as sorrow in this life as well as future suffering of the miserable realms. So in dependence upon feelings of pain, this hostility arises about these types of suffering. And then number 4, while ignorance acts in such a way to maintain in existence the suffering produced by the other two. So one is ignorant. What a type of ignorance we could say here is one says that the 5 migrations have no cause, for instance, so they are not caused. So this would be an example of ignorance, and dependence upon ignorance, which comes about by neutral feelings. One maintains the existence in suffering, and maintains the things that are brought about by the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering or suffering of pain. So this is what the problem is with these This is what the problem is with these 3 types of suffering, and in this case, number 5. The 3 poisons and what they specifically individually give rise to. We'll take a short. So Rinpoche has been asked who Ngawang Rabgye is, and Ngawang Rabgye is one of the 4 writers in the commentary called the 4 Interwoven Commentaries, and he's one of the 4 main commentators on the Lam Rim tradition. We would say that there are 18 in total, but the main 4 are Basu Chuji Jetsen, the Dedruk Machen Ngawang Rabgye, Jamyang Shepa Ripi Dorje, and Dratsi Geshe Rinchen Dundru. So these are the 4 authors, and we always use Jamyang Shepa's commentary in this class. But also in this same text we have those other writers commenting as well, and that's why it's called sometimes interwoven, because it's all written together in one text. Geshe Sutrim Nanje. Sutrim Nanje Nan. Nanje. Gel. So these are the 4 main writers, and we find it in these notes, the interlineal notes commentary. And then these were put together by Sutrim Nanjao, and then put in together into this one text and cleaned or
wrong spelling.
Wrong
spelling. Cleaned wrong spelling.
Corrected wrong spellings and so forth. So cleaned it, washed it, corrected any of the incorrect spellings.
That Druba Deresha Druba. Druba that Swa the Wal Dungenta what the Chachi Judica Gures, Swa and what the Dina Swa the Walla Dunga to tell and the Chagasa. Swa Dunga la Pumbo de Dungaji Jutsuba Yimbe Dunga Jutsuba Yimbe Tele Songatara Shuma San and Shadan Gasa. And Swa Tanyu ne Mataba Sejin Gubiraji to Tela ne Tamuka Gures Swa Sun Tusunji Jumotuma Sawate Trubatere Swa Sun de Lewate Niemita Swa Sun de Swa de One de Chak Judan Contra de Swa Dangan de Timu Contra Judan Swa Tanyu Timu Juin, but there were Kagures Trubat Lotte Hedu. Then Swa de Wala Dungan to tell a de Chaga Swa Dungan la Hobon de Dungaji Jutuba Yimbe. Tele Sungutara Shoma San La Shadanka, Contra Ures, Toa Danula Nemataba, Sejin Gubi, Rajinto, Tela, Temugade, Toa Sun Tusunji, Jumotuma was what Truba.
So number 6 is how do you prevent and get rid of the 3 feelings that give rise to the 3 poisons. So This is the number 6 category. How do you abandon these things? So here it says, therefore, attachment ceases when you see pleasant feelings as suffering. In the case of painful feelings, hostility ceases when you consider that since these aggregates of body and mind are a collection of causes for suffering, painful feelings arise from them just as physical affliction does. In the case of neutral feelings, ignorance ceases when you see that they are impermanent, exhaustible, and perishable in nature. In this way, you prevent the 3 feelings from giving rise to the 3 mental poisons. So the happy feelings give rise to the mental poison of attachment. Suffering feelings or painful feelings give rise to the poison of hatred or anger. And then neutral feelings give rise to the poison of ignorance. So this category deals with how we abandon those 3 things that give rise to those 3 results. So that's the number 6.
사지 뒤지네 어떤 맛이를 도와주시베 또 콩가봐요 수송 버스나 내주시베 살로 송도 내주시베 사당 된로 도유 공바 진도 셰바 오스질 뭐지고데 어때 동해송들 동해 쪽 어떤 과요야데 내주시베 사 루베 바바 투메지 내주시베 사당 나바텐로 아바 도아이 두유 공바진도 셰바 오고사 사등아 도나니 내주셔비사 등아노 내주셔비사요 말베 내주셔비살 송요아레스 안에 도나니 도와도 kuntu 도알이 송바나지 ወጀ르메 쳬고테 송바레스다
The Kongupa.
콩고바데레도.
So now we get into number 7, and it deals with the origin, or who, where is this from? What is the origin of these points? Then Dungyal Sung, or Dungyal Sung Dru J. Dun.
True, the
Oh, okay, the Kongupa. Okay.
Okay.
So here in this section, it's called "What is the Origin?" or who wrote this? What is the origin? So what is the origin of these 6 points that were already made? So we say there's 7 categories. So these 6 points that are made by Lama Tsongkhapa here, where did they come from? And here it says that I have explained these in accordance with a compendium of determinations and the levels of yogic deeds. So these are the texts by Master Asanga, who wrote is it 5 or 6 treatises on the levels? 5. Who wrote the treatises on the levels and then the 2 compendiums. This is where the origin or the source is of these 6 points that were made. So it's Asanga's 5 treatises, right? 5 treatises on the levels, and then the 2 compendiums. And this particular treatise is the levels of yogic deeds, or levels of yogic practice.
Oh, that then Oma Balil, Oma, Neju should be an Kasa Sajini this one.
Now we get into the Madhyama.
Shansa Lota, Oma Baloniro, that Shansa Lutare, that Oma Balil, Omaba. Omaba, Oma Lota Sheba La, Chaban Duji, Chautuji Domes at the Tombatre, the Chautuji Domen, Bana, Kuchambu Koana, Kuchambu Cheroana, Kotutan. Koguba Tetanto, Doa Mabajin dos, Nyana Pombi Ko, Chesi Koguba Tesito, Dungawan Jutes, Pombundela, Dungan, Nyamuji Nangale, ten chaba yuebe ane duji dunga de yuenas duji dunga de yuena chu dunga tata maybe kar shonyas chu dan chua tanyu de chua tanyu ngo ju ko chua dunga de doa yuji marwa 내가 매바 인다야 주 내가 다다 거를 줘야 담아타 고나주네 동네도 마치베나 뉴지지 동네 사지 소화단유들 뉴지지 처바 뉴지지 동네서 말베 뉴지지 동네네 동네 탄지라 처바다스 초아 단유되게 초아도 월 저그래 네 초아도 그래 쳐도 그랬어 그 제시 발을 때네 초아도 와지 용 그래 그 제시 발을 때네 네 초아 네 도와지 용 그랬어 저게니지 뭐 임베 ndla choa 마도 공모사 어때 대바도 담부디 말 담부 엄마바
근데 민가래
메들에 와대 차반 류시진 차주지 등에 당사 차반 류시진 차주지 등에 성도 와대
is it pervasive suffering pervasive kind of suffering pervades is it pervasive suffering
차반 류시 차주지 등에 당사 차주지 등에서 와대
so it's the number okay so now we've gone through the category, which is the levels of yogic deeds, where we have the origin from the levels of yogic deeds, where there are 7 categories. And now we get into the Madhyamaka view. And then the first point that is made is that pervasive compounded suffering pervades suffering. So in the same way that someone bearing a heavy burden cannot be happy so long as the burden must be borne, you too will suffer as long as you carry the burden of the appropriated aggregates. Though you have occasional moments when painful feeling is absent, because the aggregates are firmly embedded in dysfunctional tendencies of suffering and the afflictions, the suffering of conditionality is still present, and therefore myriad sufferings are just on the verge of arising in countless ways. Therefore, since the suffering of conditionality pervades all suffering and is the root of the other types of suffering, meditate on it often in order to become disenchanted with it. So if there is this suffering of change, a happy feeling, there is necessarily the pervasive compounded suffering or the suffering of conditionality. If there is the painful feeling, the suffering of suffering, then there necessarily is pervasive compounded suffering. So this pervasive compounded suffering or suffering of conditionality pervades all of the other types of suffering. So it's present, it's there if those other types are there as well.
코드 제상 코고바 대수 등아서 도트니 컨치마 있나 도트니 컨치마 있나 어때 도트 등에 여러 등에 말배 네 콜코와 대상도 네 대상도 주고바 대진도 도와 매바진도 코드 큰 돈도 도와요 말와 녀안에 폼봉가 가수 코레스 폼봉가는 코로 코고하면 가자 코스 폼봉가는 코스 가수 조지 봉고로서 봐 그 폼봉가는 가수 도치 나무 그래서 뭐 말해 폼봉가는 코로 코고하면 가자 코스 가수 도치 나무 도데 등에 폼봉가데 이사 말해 그 전부 철와 코트장 네 코고바 대장도 도와매진도 녀안에 폼비 코양 녀안에 폼봉가에 등에 코양 지시 종고바 대시도 두경원 주데스 녀안에 폼보 사지 녀안에 폼보 그 폼보 되어 대시도 나가술 등에 용거레스 두경원 주데 폼본들라 등에다 녀모지 내게래 땡차바 유베 뉴지지 등에 뒤에 나왔어 폼본들라 등에 당 녀모비 내게래 땡차바 ten chaba yobis dunga ta nyomo bi jun da to te pombo de yodres chaba yobi duji dunga de yonas chaba duji dunga pombo ngaba de yona chu dunga tata maybe kore shoyas nyale pombo de yoba ina what the chu kore shoyang tamata to gunhasu ne dunga tomachi venas What Chancel doing Jungore, Chancel the Wajung, what this one the Marbe, Pomungadu, Yuna, and then Negojil the water doing a meba in a good doing Ungre, doing Ungre, the Wajungres, what this one the inside. Tata, maybe a courage on Tamata, young good Hasune, doing a tomachi na, Duji doing a and dunga tangji la chaba tang dunga tangji la chaba tang chaba duji dunga sa tere dunga tangji la chaba tang dunga jini ji zawa yinbe de la jua ma du gomos chaba duji dunga beji chwa tanyu da ta chaba duji jidan chaba duji dunga sa na jigo chwa tanyu sa na jigo sa marbe ko dunga ji dunga ju dunga ni ji ji gres Daniel Chowdhuris. That's what Daniel Chabaduji doing Dungal Chowsade, the Yuna Dungal Leon Marbe.
Lesser.
Chabatan Ne Dunga Jeniji, Zawaya Yimbe, Dula Jua Modu, Gomos, Omabu, Tombatere.
So now we get in again to the points made according to the Madhyamaka. The Uma, the Tambo. Tambo still. Okay. So then we have this example that's given. So we go back to the beginning here. This is the first point in the Madhyamaka section. In the same way that someone bearing a heavy burden cannot be happy so long as the burden must be borne, you too will suffer as long as you carry the burden of the appropriated aggregates. These aggregates that form and the others. So we have 5 aggregates, and this is what it's referring to, these contaminated aggregates. And if we have these contaminated aggregates, then we necessarily have suffering. So it's as though you have occasional moments when painful feeling is absent. So sometimes you have happiness, sometimes you have pain, because the aggregates are firmly embedded in dysfunctional tendencies of suffering and the afflictions. The suffering of conditionality is still present, and therefore myriad sufferings are just on the verge of arising in countless ways. So there's this pervasive compounded suffering is present. Then it will give rise to the various other types of suffering. The suffering of change and the suffering of pain, or the happy feelings and suffering feelings will necessarily arise. It says, therefore, since the suffering of conditionality pervades all suffering and is the root of the other 2 types of suffering, meditate on it often in order to become disenchanted with it. So become familiar with this so you can see the faults, you can see the negativities. This is why it's called pervasive compounded suffering, because it pervades all suffering. So we have here, it says, since the suffering of conditionality pervades all suffering, really it's called pervasive suffering because it pervades all suffering, is what Rinpoche is saying. That it's called this pervasive, compounded suffering because of this pervasion that we find here, that's stated in the text.
and saji so the ku so the ju dong se marbe the one pemuchi momo bu donge ji shir ju bala Dunga Jubala, do you logiba in Jesa? Dunga Jubala, Dunga the Mandi Dibala, and what the dog logiba is. Juba in Jes, Juba in J, Dua would have a San Tambaremato, Dunga Sambala Matuba, Dunga Sambala Matubi, Moniji the one matters, Dunga Sambala Matubi, and never to be the way you matters, then the invasion. What to later was a puna, Rutabe, Dunhawana, Debe, De Lunjuma, De Nami, Dunge, Chirine, Gabice, Tawarinji, Cheber, Hawaii, Moniji, the one, Yoba Metes, Tangazo, what the Ruba ina, Dunge or Ruba. Rugi come up and Ruba ina, Dunge Rota. Oh, the shade of the Puna, Rutabe, Dungawanas, and Mummun Kalik can do Gawana. Deba in out the Wayungres. Debe, do you Lunjuan? Do you Lunjuante? Hame Dunge, Chirin and Gabice, do you Dunget and Gabice, what they do over there? The Wagulotiche Yungres, the Warinji, Chiba, no inches, and Tabatubi, the Wayumares, Moniji. And the one met is one is in the debate to be the way you must umar, then the invasion made the higher de trana, young de trana doing a marbe, de trana, hamatar doing a jibisharos. One is the Juna, one is the Juna, doing a Joe, Chetara Temba Tanji. Dunga Chipito, Roajindo, Rodutan, Niebatan, Zatuntan, Niema da Tema, Tema Temba Sujan, Chesan Rindu Temba Tetanto, Deva Chipito, Rugubala, Rintana, Dugin Baji, Chibatan is your Puma Bajado, Puma Marba. Ro Rana Dungeres, Dena Doyungores, and then do not doare, do Rana Dungungres, Niena doare, Niechana Dunge, Gonalas who Dungeres, Tene Zatun to Zukangal what is hard to Zukangal, and what Telaten Dungaja was. Zatun and Yaman Deva in a Chibra, Dena. They trana doing a chingres, Taman Dena, the one that you are there, they trana doing a ching, Temba Su Chang. Chetan Rinto, Temba, Tetanto, the Wachipito, Rugubala, Rintrana, doing Baji Cheba, how you should rose. What did you think of the Uma?
So this next part starts to deal with the suffering of change, those happy feelings. So the paragraph before that I just left one off. It's sufficient to say that this is referring to equal feeling. So now we get into happy feelings, the suffering of change. Moreover, your current pleasant feelings, which cause attachment to grow, mostly arise only upon the relief of suffering. Pleasure does not exist naturally independently of the removal of suffering. For example, so here what this is stating is that it is not truly established. This current pleasant feeling which causes attachment to grow is not truly established. It's not truly established because it dependently originates. So this dependent origination is why it's not truly established. For example, if you suffer because of too much walking, a pleasant state of mind arises when you sit down. Then, as the earlier intense suffering fades, pleasure appears to rise gradually. Yet sitting is not naturally pleasant, because if you sit too long, suffering arises again just as it did before. So this naturally, it does not truly establish as pleasant. its nature is not that because it dependently originates. And it says, because if you sit too long, suffering arises again, just as before. Suppose that sitting and other postures were causes of pleasure by their very nature. Just as suffering increases in proportion to your involvement with the causes of suffering, so should your pleasure increase the longer you walk, sit, lie down, eat, or drink, or stand in the sun or shade. However, it is clear that if you do any of these for too long, suffering is all that results. These things, when we look at the suffering of change, look at happy feelings, and we look at these different subjects, walking, sitting, lying down, drinking, eating, standing in the sun or the shade, we see that the suffering comes about when we walk too long, or when we sit too long, or when we lie down too much, or eating and drinking, or standing in the sun or the shade. We see that this change takes place, and these things do turn into a form of suffering. So they are not by nature pleasurable, because they are by nature not truly established.
What did that Tamal Ruad and do what the water doing, which at the Susan was near to Jubal Theatre, near to Jubales, near to Juba, Tendo Yurdo, near to Jubale, Gausa, Chabatan, Dubatans, Chabas and Romarve, Druna, Dungere, Dena, and then what do I know? Dubatan, Dino Yalangina. Or Julian do here or done what Niana do or Tanyachana Yadu, what to sook not deal hit the door. Nye is a Shulon Tajan. So, doing our river shatesa. So, doing our river shatte. And then Runa and Runa do what doing it is Dena doa. De Trana doing it. Lana doa yang lana doing nyena doa nyena doing what the Shulon Tajan Susu doing one riba shates Shulon draw cha nyandu Shulon jet red water what the Sulatin doing the Yungu what the Shegures riba shate Sante be Shulon Tatan Tadaki Rajita Sante Gunja Wote Shulon Tadaki Nesu Tane Kete Chabi Nyamandawa Shejin Dima Majiban Duba Majinyawa Majina Te Chabatela Dunga Kona Susu Nyon Jushin Chaba Nitan, Tuba Nitan, Mazeba Nitan, Ido, Moa Ni Susur, Nyon Juji, Chaba Tela, Di Dushin Juan, Menjuro Shes Monsins, what the Rocha Niadu, what is the Conto, what is a Marbe?
I'm just trying to find an English word stuff.
Near to Jubilon, John, what the Tamati Conti, but Drona Dunga, Dena Dawa, Detana Dunga, what does it do something there?
Less so. So we find the points made here in Sutra, the Descent into the Womb Sutra, where it says Nanda, the physical activities of walking, sitting, standing, or lying down must be understood as suffering. If meditators analyze the nature of these physical activities, they will see that if they spend the day walking and do not rest, sit down, or lie down, they will experience walking exclusively as suffering, will experience intense, sharp, unbearable, and unpleasant feelings. The notion that walking is pleasant will not arise. So we look at these activities and we see walking goes from happiness to suffering, sitting, happiness to suffering, standing, happiness to suffering, lying down from happiness to suffering. So we see this suffering of change in these physical activities that are presented previously by Lama Tsongkhapa and then found here in this sutra. Then the Shuloka ni yure nipa the chu losong.
She song jin xue long jian song la yang tata song ne se xue long jian song zhuo nian ba du ba zhu cha nian du ji ge na no ji li song de jian da le song yo song yin xia le xue long jian song la yang tata song ne ga wu
okay
yuan jiang xue long ji du ne de dang te jun ji bi shi de saba jen dang jen jo de du lu xi zhong de sa ta da ban ju de de xi jiao de mu de wo de de ga ne de wo de wa de jian yong wa de shi de lu xi zhong de ga wu zhong wa na yang de ko nan zhong la sa zhong wa na yang de ko nan zhong la ga ba na yang de ko nan ga sa ji ta ji du ge wa wo de shi ge nan zhong wa na yang du ji ni zhong la ga na yang du ji ni ga gu xie song xin sa wo de ba de le wo ta ma de ma den de sa ma de.
After discussing the other three physical activities in the same way, the text continues. Nevertheless, Nanda, because they break the continuity, the other three physical activities, I think Rinpoche said before, drink or eat, stand or eat, stand in the sun or the shade. I'm not... Rinpoche, this sum gare.
No.
That's right here. Sholan Shen Sum.
Sholan Shen Sum ro, Sholan Shen Sum, Dalma Chaba. Chaba do dom de xie de man ro. Ta ro cha nian du se ro. Cha nian du. Sholan xie de ma de. De chaba le ja ne Shen Sum le wo de song du song yin sa de.
Walking, sitting, lying down.
There are four, and they explain the first one, and the other three.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I'm sorry. So of these four, walking, sitting, standing, or lying down. I was just looking at Lama Tsongkhapa. He has more. So the four, walking, sitting, standing, or lying down. The first one is explained and says the other three physical activities in the same way. So, nevertheless, Nanda, because they break the continuity of suffering in one or the other of the physical activities, some other new suffering arises, and this they take to be pleasure. Nanda, when the contaminated feeling of pleasure arises, it is only suffering that is arising. When it ends, it is only the nature of suffering that ends. When it arises yet again, it is only the compositional activity that arises. When it ends, it is only compositional activity that ends.
Wo da de wo de ji jia bu long ji dang mo de ji jia ba le jang pi jin ba yi de wa la ta nga so ju de nga sa de ji ro che dan du ba tong jo wa de de nge pi jin la du ba yo ba ma yi no she song bi she ro sa pi jin ba yi de wa la che tar du ba ni tong wa pi jin be dwa te do ba de nge mar be do nge ju dwa je tar do ba sa na te do shu do nge yi wa tong jo wa te de do nge pi jin la do nge de pi jin ba te do shu de do mar be do ba ma yi no do ba yo ba ma yi no sa ta ngo ni ju ba ma yi sa ko ma she song bi shi ro sa.
So here now we have a quote from Aryadeva's 400 verses that shows the nature of these things. Pleasure, when it increases, is seen to change into pain. Pain, when it increases, does not likewise change into pleasure. So when pleasure increases, becomes greater, then it becomes pain. But suffering, when it becomes greater, or pain, when it becomes greater, doesn't necessarily change into pleasure, become pleasurable. The greater the pain.
What about that?
So we've gotten now through the 3 types of suffering. Now we're going to get into the 6 reflection on the specific types of suffering, the individual sufferings.
What the truth you want to what the marvel. Susu Bale. Nason Suji Dungas on the Shea Saint Os. Nason Su Dungas and Hashe Savares. That the Dendro man. That Dendro man, Lama is in a Sondaba in a Troy Urota. And May Dungan, Jason May Dungan, Jason Kumba the Trugutu at the Kakumbatan, Tsai Dungan, and Tsai Dungan. And Tadongi, Reba Yidu, or Sadong Reba Yidu, Moata, Sujudan, Nayu Dunga, Jen, Chiganachi, Dungas Udune, Hashebe Sheba Shawosa, Damal water Dunga Jetan, through the moment of water nor Chinsabare, she Saba in Son.
So now we get into reflection on specific sufferings or individual sufferings, and this is the individual sufferings refer to the 3 sufferings, the lower realms, and then the 3 lower realms suffering, their individual sufferings, and then the 3 higher realms, their individual suffering. So the hell hungry ghost animal and the human demigod god. So and then we've already gone over the lower realms. So reflection on specific sufferings. Of the 6 kinds of specific sufferings, I have already explained above the sufferings of the 3 miserable realms. So the 3 lower realms have already been explained, and now we get into the various sufferings of the higher realms of cyclic existence. And then we begin with the suffering of human beings. Suffering human beings having to experience the suffering of pain, of hunger, thirst, unpleasant sensations of heat and cold, the suffering of searching for sustenance. Let me just read it. And from what has been explained above, you should understand that the suffering of human beings consists of the pain of hunger and thirst, unpleasant sensations of heat and cold, and the suffering of searching for sustenance and becoming fatigued. It is also birth, old age, illness, death, and so on, the 7 that I have already explained before. So those 7 that were previously explained. So we've gone over the various types of suffering, the 8 types of suffering, 6 types of suffering, 3 types of suffering, and now we're getting to those specifics. So the 7 that have already been explained previously. Dixon.
Yeah.
So it looks like we'll end class there, and. So we'll do the concluding mandala offering and dedication prayer, unless someone has a specific question. Okay. The fundamental ground is scented with incense and strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha land and offer it. May all sentient beings enjoy this pure realm. I dedicate whatever virtues I have collected for the benefit of the teachings and of all sentient beings, and in particular for the essential teachings of Venerable Lobsang Drakpa to shine forever. I send forth this jeweled mandala to you, precious Guru. I dedicate all this virtue to emulate the knowledge of the hero Manjushri and likewise Samantabhadra as well, with whatever dedication is praised as supreme by all the conquerors who traverse the 3 times. I also dedicate all my roots of virtue for the sake of auspicious deeds. In that pure land surrounded by snowy mountains, you are the source of all benefit and happiness. All-powerful Avalokiteshvara Tenzin Yatso, may you stay until samsara's end. I pray for the long life of the precious Khensur Wandak, upholder of scriptural and realizational doctrines, spiritual friend who trained extensively in the 5 great philosophical texts, exceptional wisdom and perseverance. Suji Rinpoche Kuchi Shapi